Super. Excellent. So, good day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this webinar that the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime is hosting today on the important issue about how to use data to create better impact. With us today, we have Dr. Tony Murney, who is a product of a distinguished academic, police, and also security sector reform career. So thank you for initiating this, Tony. We're really, really happy to have you here, and thank you so much for coming. In our initial discussions with Tony, we talked about a lot of different things that resonated with me. So how do you use data for impact? The importance of understanding local contexts when designing responses. And as a fellow anthropologist, I think that really struck home. And then how do we adapt and co-create and design appropriate responses that reflect both local context and the data that we're seeing? So it's actually, it's like a sexy way of looking at data, using indices and data to start conversations. This is exactly what we do at the GI, to challenge old concepts and to really generate a discourse and discussion. So Tony has a presentation to dazzle you with for the next 25 minutes. We will then open up to questions. So please get ready with your hands. We can open up cameras. You can drop your questions in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be really happy to get that discussion going. So, Tony, over to you on mapping the world order.
Thank you, Louise. I'd like to open by saying that the world order and data with these sorts of problems that we deal with, particularly in terms of policing, crime, and the delivery of aid assistance, has been a fascination since I started many years ago with the International Deployment Group of the Australian Federal Police. What we were doing, the Australian government at a particularly important time in the history of our country, established a 1,200 person standing capacity for deployment to other countries to assist with development of police services, stabilisation operations, peacekeeping, a whole series of other reformist sort of methodologies that we worked on. One of the problems that became really obvious there, but also in my work with the UN and a number of other countries, is that when we build strategies to deal with problems in individual countries, we tend to focus only on that country. From a policing perspective, tactical operators call that tunnelling. And tunnelling's a really dangerous thing. Tunnelling means you see just what you're looking at, but there might be other issues or threats coming at you from other directions. That tends to be what we've done. So we've produced solutions without properly understanding, in many cases, where the nations that we're working with sit in the international global order. And that's a powerful index of the degree of difficulty we're going to face in whatever endeavour we happen to be pursuing, whether it's a straight-out aid endeavour where you could be subject to a whole series of vagaries from corruption to criminality, limiting the scope for effective program delivery, through to policing issues where we're dealing with transnational crime. And transnational crime we'll talk a bit more about later, but it's one of the truly wicked problems of the 21st century, a wicked problem being one that every time you try to solve it, it somehow finds a way of wriggling out from under your grasp. Poverty is another wicked problem, and that's the nature of wicked problems. I've got a number of slides I want to share with you, and I just hope I can bring up the right screen. Right, I think I've got it. Have all you guys got that that introductory screen, Louise?
We do. Congratulations.
Good. Okay. When you start to mess around with large quantities of data, it can be very much like throwing mud at a wall, hoping you'll find things that are important or significant. What happens when you do that, particularly with the quantum of data we're dealing with when we start to mess around in the international community, is that it becomes a serious problem of confusion. And then you start inventing relationships without previously having thought about what they might be. So for this presentation, I've put together a simple conceptual interaction model. And the interaction model is designed to take some of the key variables. The two key variables that interest me most are government effectiveness and rule of law as underpinning variables that determine what our society looks like and how we might amend or modify some of the features that we need to change to support our own development as a species, if you like. This interaction model links government effectiveness, rule of law, corruption, gross national income per capita, and human development. And basically, it starts off as a very simple structure, and it's the idealised structure that we might all imagine. Government effectiveness and rule of law provide a basis for the strong performance of public and private institutions. If they're working well, that provides a stimulus for gross national income, and if that's working well, that spills over to human development, and then it works the reverse way. Human development improves gross national income. That's a virtuous circle or a virtuous loop. We also find that effective rule of law, the sort of business end of this diagram, gross national income, that feeds back into resourcing for better rule of law and government effectiveness. Now, when I talk about government effectiveness, these measures are very broad, and we won't be able to go into detail in this presentation because it's normally about a 2-hour presentation, and many slides are missing. But what we sort of tend to forget is that, with government effectiveness and rule of law, we get a confusion in discussing this where participants often assume that rule of law, strong rule of law, is repressive. These measures are built on liberal democratic ideals. They reflect UN values, and so they're not repressive. A country that is extraordinarily repressive in terms of rule of law or the effectiveness of its government actually rates lowly in these indicators, rather than a country that accepts the need to take into account human rights and all the other sorts of issues that the UN values incorporate. What happens to the ideal model, though, is the real world invariably intrudes in it. And corruption emerges. It's emerged. It's in every country in the world. The highest rating country last year in the perceptions of corruption index was New Zealand, Australia's next door neighbour. Even with New Zealand, though, there are claims and allegations about corruption. Australia, for example, is in 15th place. We used to perform much better, and we've been slipping behind. We recently formed a NAC, a national, basically it's an authority against corruption, to conduct investigations into political dealings. When the legislation was passed, however, the NAC's not allowed to report a large number of its findings. It's not allowed to publish lists of allegations that have been made and so forth. So transparency, which is critical in fighting corruption, has already been undermined in something as simple as the NAC. What happens with this model is that this is theoretically how it would work. If government effectiveness and rule of law increase, performance in public-private institutions perform better, gross national income goes up, human development goes up, corruption goes down. And so the system becomes green, which is supportive of the current processes, this sort of desirable way we want the society to run. And the corruption stream goes red, which means that it's weakened in those processes. If, however, we change those performance measures, the system goes red and it becomes reinforcingly or falls into reinforcing decline, and corruption grows in a fairly positive way. So that's the model that underpins a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next 20 odd minutes. And it's only there as an ideas thing that allows you to place some of the data that I'm going to show you as we work through it. This is a chart that shows rule of law and government effectiveness for the 191 of the 193 member states of the United Nations. Now, unless you've actually got a very big screen like I've got sitting in front of me, it's very hard to read the names of the countries. But one thing I must stress too before I go on, the data that we're using, which are World Bank data and UNDP data, as well as OCI data, are not suitable in many cases for direct minor comparisons between countries, particularly as we move towards the weaker performing nation states, because there's not much data available and the error terms go up fairly dramatically in this part of the world, whilst in this part of the world up here, which is the sort of more developed, more matured nation states, data has far greater availability. We can see from this chart, though, just by names, that there's three groups of countries, at least. The first group is highly performing from a material point of view: Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Luxembourg, San Marino. We have a middle part of the world down here, which is a really interesting, this is a dynamic place to be. And down here, we have the countries that have been all too often at the bottom end of the world for a long time, places like Haiti, South Sudan, Somalia, Syria, Libya, Eritrea, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And these are countries that have largely been affected by internecine warfare and violence. So there's categories you can see that make some sense using this measure. The most interesting thing about this chart is that the whole world falls within a development envelope. There are no countries outside of the envelope, and the association between rule of law and government effectiveness is nearly 90%. So here we've got an 88.8% accounting variations in the x-axis, accounting for variations in the y-axis. So changes in rule of law, 80% associated with changes in government effectiveness. That's an important finding. And when we look at charts like this is what people tend to look at. They look at this bit and they look at this figure, but they don't look at these other bits. What's going on here? And it raises questions about why there's no countries there. And in fact, those tendencies are so strong that no UN member state with weak rule of law has strong government effectiveness. No UN member state, in this case, with strong rule of law, has weak government effectiveness. And that spreads proportionately across the whole map that we've just drawn. The interesting thing about this is the world's been running major development programs, including peacekeeping operations, since immediately after the end of World War II. So from the 1950s, this is interventions by the West to try and support forms of development have been pretty active. But with all of those changes, not once have we managed to take a country with low rule of law and artificially create an environment where it lives in this space at the top end of the chart, a high-performing, low rule of law country. Nor have we been able to do the same where we can take a weak government effectiveness nation and produce a high rule of law effect. It just doesn't happen. And in the brief for this presentation, I raised the question of the possible versus the impossible. If we're talking development in terms of rule of law and government effectiveness, this is the possible, this envelope. The impossible, and it's demonstrated by the absence of any nation state in these parts of the chart, is in these areas. So without achieving significant changes in rule of law or significant changes in government effectiveness, one or other of those options, they're mutually dependent on one another. And it's either because they're flip sides of the same coin, or it's possibly because they're flip sides. It's possibly because they reinforce one another. If we're going to look at corruption later on, and I had an issue in my mind about whether or not the World Bank measure of corruption, which is this measure over here, and the perceptions of corruption index produced by Transparency International are remotely similar. I just wanted some assurance that they were measuring the same thing, so that it didn't matter which measure we used. This chart shows that there's a 98.6, nearly a 100% association between these two measures, which leaves me comfortable in the choice I made. The perception of corruption, or perceptions of corruption index, has a smaller coverage, not a greatly smaller coverage than the World Bank measure. So I've chosen to use the World Bank measure, and that's what that's there for. If we look now, I'm going to show this. This is a chart that covers rule of law and control of corruption for 191 UN states. As you can see, we've got a fairly similar pattern starting to emerge again. We've got an 88% association between rule of law and control of corruption, and there is a 99% association between control of corruption and perceptions of corruption. This shows the same pattern that we saw in that first chart. No UN member state with weak rule of law has strong control of corruption. No UN member state with strong rule of law has weak control of corruption. That's the same, and the same process follows as for the previous chart. This takes you to the situation with a second set of variables where we've got a contrast now between development possibilities and impossibilities. This, inside that envelope, is possible. And you can actually just drop a simple geometric circle around that, or an oval, and it'll cover 100% of this with very little leftover space. That's the envelope within which the world has been able to move. There are lots of questions about why that is, but we might talk about those towards the end. When we start to look at the impossible, it's exactly the same as before. There are no examples that we can find from the existing data of nation states occupying these spaces here or these spaces here. Now, if that's an accident, then we have a look at government effectiveness and control of corruption. It's no surprise that we see a very similar pattern, because government effectiveness and rule of law are so closely associated with one another. But again, we get the same pattern, and we can speed this up a bit. Same sort of envelope, which is a development envelope. Similar but not as high association between these two dimensions of development. 83.6%, so 84% rounding upwards. And we get the same thing with no UN member state in either of these two quadrants here, and only limited intrusion into these in association with this development envelope. Now, when we start to look at other variables in that model, you might recall that we looked at control of corruption. We looked at gross national income, corruption, and a series of others. We're not modelling the actual links in that chart. We're just looking for associations. So when we look at this association between control of corruption and gross national income, we find a 56% association between control of corruption and gross national income per capita. When we, you might notice there's only 190 states there. I took Liechtenstein out because it sits way off the screen, and it became quite difficult for the measures. You'll see a later one where I left it in. And we have a world pattern again, which fits in an envelope that's the development envelope for the world as far as this goes, with the exception of Qatar there and Liechtenstein sitting outside the chart. The average income, the median income for the world at this point with those 190 states is $12,361 US dollars per capita. Over here, you can see half the world is trapped against this x-axis, against the low income measures. But there's a large spread for control of corruption. Now, it's a really interesting outcome that we see here. Down here, the outcomes are pretty well determined. No UN state, weak control of corruption, has strong GNP. But when we look into this section, not all UN states with strong control of corruption have strong GNIPC. So we get into a situation where now the sort of issues we saw first up are now becoming more nuanced. But nevertheless, when we talk about a 56% association between two variables, when you're doing social and economic research, getting associations of that strength, that would be regarded as very high. The ones we've seen earlier are exceptional. When we look at control of corruption and human development, it's a bit different again. And I'm just using different ways of describing how these charts can be chopped up using non-statistical techniques that anybody can apply when you look at a chart like this. We still have a moderate association, as with the last chart, between control of corruption and human development. There's a 52% association in this chart, but when you look at the breakdown, down here, there's practically no association. So with low control of corruption, there's a whole series of variances occurring in here that would need further explanation, further investigation to explain. The most common proposition here is that this spread is due, in fact, to improvements arising from Western interventions in the delivery of aid. There's no evidence, no causal links to prove that. But then when we move up to here, the opportunities start to narrow. Control of corruption for more highly performing countries as we move up this chart, or we move up this sort of lessening range of options, becomes really quite critical to the nature of what these nations are all about. So again, it's just something to bear in mind. When we look at rule of law and gross national income per capita, we get another really interesting pattern. Down at the bottom, two things to note. Firstly, you've got a 64% association between rule of law and gross national income per capita. And the best fit line for this is an exponential curve. And what that means is that down here, change is very slight. But once you move into this control of corruption and high income area, it grows at an exponential rate. And that's going to be really important for something else that has to be said later. But what that really means is relatively large changes in rule of law outcomes are associated with relatively small changes in gross national income per capita. Up here, relatively large rule of law outcomes are associated with increasingly large changes in gross national income per capita. Again, you get this sort of thing, and I think it's more doubtful to chop the chart up this way, but I threw it in as something for people to consider themselves. This one is probably valid. No UN state with weak rule of law has strong gross national income per capita. Over here, I'm not so certain, because you've got these countries in here that show reasonably strong rule of law, but they're not generating higher levels of income, and there can be lots of reasons for that. The reality is that some countries have more spaces than others. Some countries have been or nation states have been in existence longer than others. And so you can get a lot of variability that we aren't necessarily going to try and explain with just these two measures. When we look at, I'm speeding up a little bit now, when we look at rule of law and human development, we get another association that is still regarded as moderate. So it's 58, rounding, and it's 58%. It fits in a development envelope that is big down here, which is like the circle we saw in the previous one. The association isn't great if you break it down to this pattern, but it becomes really important up here. I've shaded this area of the chart for one reason, which is there's two issues emerging with the Human Development Index. One is that we're looking here at the Human Development Index as it emerged. This is the current baseline. There's no country below this for the Human Development Index, about 4.5, something like that, a bit over. When the Human Development Index first came into, or was first produced, and that was back in about 1990 from recollection, the lowest country in the world was 2. So we have seen some major improvements. Something up here to think about is that this is showing that humanity is reaching some sort of apex, that life will never get any better. And these factors sort of raise questions about the need to reconfigure this index. So bear that in mind. This is just to show you can map this sort of thing. You can start to look at countries, look at patterns and see what's going on. Similar patterns I mentioned before, conflict nations here, nations at various stages of development in here, nations that are fairly strongly developed with pretty high per capita incomes and so forth in that top level. Government effectiveness and gross national income, much more strongly curvilinear than for rule of law. The association this time is even much stronger at rounding 69% association, relatively large change in gross government effectiveness outcomes associated with relatively small GNI, and the same as for income on that one, and I won't stay on this any longer. You're seeing a similar sort of pattern here with government effectiveness and human development. The association, again, is rock solid, moderate, verging on strong. You can measure them like that. And here we come to some other issues that I've only really just started to work with, which is aspects of criminality associated with government effectiveness. And this is exploratory, and I've thrown up 3 sets of data for you. One set is government effectiveness and state-embedded criminal activity. Unlike the other associations, this is negative. So as government effectiveness increases, state embedded criminality decreases, and that's rounding up nearly to 50%. So it's not to be ignored. Over here, political stability and non-violence linked to criminal actors, not embedded actors, just criminal actors, just trying to see if that group tied up in the sort of conflict phase of their existence at the bottom of the world or at the lower end of the world are sources of criminal activity. There's a near 50% association again. As development in government effectiveness improves, stability and non-violence diminishes. Over here, state-embedded criminal actors, it's almost a foregone conclusion. Rule of law against state-embedded criminal actors. 60% association basically says that as rule of law increases, embedded of criminal actors in the state diminishes. Control of corruption, state-embedded criminal actors, 67% association. Same thing, as control of corruption improves, the encountering of embedded criminal actors in the state diminishes fairly rapidly. Rule of law and the Trans-Organised Crime Resilience Index, very strong association between these two measures, an 81% association. Over here, government effectiveness and resilience, rounded up 78%. These are very high associations between two concepts that are measured quite differently. And they raise questions that we could probably explore better in the discussion. I'm running close to time, so I want to get to this. We go back to the model that we outlined before. Now, we've got those percentages you've actually seen the distributions, what they look like, and you have heard what the measures are. When we drop it around various parts of this chart, which is more like where they belong, it's not measuring these actual links, but it's associations, you can build a picture up of what's going on. So, control of corruption and perceptions of corruption, 98.6% positive association. Government effectiveness and control of corruption, 83.65% positive association. Rule of law and control of corruption, 88.51% positive association. Government effectiveness and rule of law, these two factors, 88.8% positive association. Control of corruption and gross national income per capita, 55.88% positive association. Control of corruption and human development, 51.56% positive association. Government effectiveness and gross national income, now I've done something wrong there. That probably, government effectiveness and gross national income, 68% association or positive association. Rule of law and gross national income, 64% association. Can't read that because I'm going to government effectiveness and human development, 66.49% association. Rule of law and human development, 57.83% association. Back over here, government effectiveness and state embedded criminal actors, 47.9% association. That's negative. Rule of law and SECA, 60.94% negative association. Political stability and non-violence and SECA, 47.3% association. And it continues on in this vein. So I think I've covered the whole chart. What you can see here is a whole range of really interesting associations between starting with government effectiveness and rule of law and trying to get some insights into what happens further down that chain of events that we've looked at so far. When we consider some of these items over on the right of the screen, we see that these things feed into two of the most important variables you can measure for nation states: gross national income per capita and human development. Now, one thing you need to recall about gross national income and the Human Development Index is gross national income is in human development. It's in the measure, so there's a degree of autocorrelation. That's my pause alarm saying get out of the presentation and let some of you speak. So, look, by way of concluding remarks, these are associations that can't be ignored. They can't be ignored if we're trying to manage crime. There are transnational crime. because a lot of those poorly performing states where government effectiveness, rule of law, corruption, and degrees of government-embedded criminality are high are very poor targets for us in terms of managing crime. And also, they're the sources of supply in many cases in the chain that produces transnational sources of crime because of their weak structures. When we're talking about development assistance, those percentages, again, are critically important. If we're dealing with nation states that look like that, considering initiatives like nationally implemented schemes for, nationally implemented schemes for development, they're almost bound to fail. When I was in Somalia in 2015, somebody stole the whole, a clique stole the whole public sector payroll, and it was put in a NIM project. So we're going to be very careful about that. It's very ambitious, but not a very smart thing to do. Thanks, Louise. Sorry about that.
No need to apologize, Tony. I think you did very well to manage your own time, because I'm a rubbish moderator, but I think I told you that already. Listen, two reflections from me. Well, one, a thanks actually for making data both penetrable and also digestible, because when I looked at your slides, I feared, frankly, that I wouldn't understand them. And you've explained them in such a way that even I understood them. So I thank you very much, because I just found it a really fascinating way of exploring some of those associations, as you call them. And actually, I came away, maybe wrongly, but with a sense of optimism that it feels like we're measuring the right things, and that these associations support the fact that we're maybe trying the right things. And I think then my kind of question is, well, why aren't we winning then? And why aren't we making more of an impact? And maybe you've got a reflection on that. But before I abuse my position as chair, I just wanted to open the floor formally and to encourage questions from, we now have over 50 people online, which is fantastic. So thank you very much for joining us. You've got a chat function, a raise hand, and a Q&A. So please, for those of you online, please do pick any one of those that you would like. And while people warm up, because some people get nervous about asking questions, and you shouldn't, by the way, because that's exactly why we're here. Maybe, Tony, you can have a bit of a reflection on my kind of observation and challenge, really, as to why aren't we winning more than we could be.
Yep. Yeah, look, thanks, Louise. One of the problems when we're dealing with transnational crime is that, I'm trying to think this through, is it relates to a whole series of things, but I'll try and demonstrate it. Don't want to show you that. I'll try and demonstrate it graphically, if I can get that. I had some extra slides on that. No, sorry, I pulled up some rubbish screen here. How do I get rid of that? That's what I wanted. One of the things I wanted to do was demonstrate what organised crime looks like. The problems with organised crime, most of the measures that we adopt in dealing with organised crime, am I still on, by the way, Louise?
Yes, you are.
Because I've lost picture, that's all. No, that's right. And everybody can see that chart?
We cannot see your chart, no.
Oh, okay. I wonder what's...
Which one is it? And I can try and do it.
Yeah, it's the first of those charts that has a network on it, straight after the finishing page.
That one.
I'm locked. I'll need to find out what I'm doing. I'm going to close this.
Slide 19.
Yeah, I need to. Oh, sorry, I know what I've got to do. Let me hit this. Now I can get back into Zoom. There. Look, that chart. What happens with organised crime? When we deal with crime, the general response by governments and by the community is we try and prohibit certain things. And basically, we prohibit activities like homicide, and we all support it. As very few people, except those who might eventually, do something pretty serious, serial killers and others who breach those sort of community standards. But we're dealing with individuals, And that applies to crimes against the person, various forms of assault, homicide, and so forth. It also applies to crimes against property. So things like break and enters at houses. It doesn't matter whether it's shoplifting or car theft. We're generally not dealing with highly organised groups. When you start to deal with an organised group, prohibition doesn't really work as effectively, because this is the sort of network we face. This is a simple network, and this is what when we adopt the law enforcement solution, it runs a natural chain. It runs a chain where government introduces a prohibition. When we look at what has to be done then by the authorities, they first have to detect the occurrence of an incident, then they have to investigate it, then they have to compile the evidence, then they have to charge somebody, then they hand it to a prosecutor, then it goes to court, then the court makes a decision, and if the decision is adverse for the alleged perpetrator, that person may be imprisoned. Now, this is a crime network here that basically shows something completely different. Police can prioritise tackling a crime work like this by going for the big dots. This is a sociogram, so these are the centre points. If we were investigating that diagram there, and we arrested everybody in it and tried to process them through the courts, that's all the court would do, and that's all we would do. Very difficult with resources to actually get hold of something like that, because it changes, the participants change, and there are a whole series of other factors that play into it. This is it. I'll get you to put the next one up, Louise. That's it. This is a more complex chart, and it's actually a sociogram. There's not a lot of really good examples that I can publish because they're not published on the net for very obvious reasons. They're dealing with organised crime groups and so forth, and there's intelligence in it. But this is an example drawn from the American Revolution, and it was produced by Kieran Healy in the US some years ago. And what he does is shows what happens with a sociogram. You can see the complexity living behind it. But the British could have actually compiled this using the data that Healy did, but they hadn't thought this through. It would have taken a long time, and in fact, it would have been very difficult at the time, because guys like Paul Revere would have been keeping his identity secret. But trying to investigate something like that is problematic. If you put the next one up, yep, there's one showing Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's getting more complex, and that doesn't have the foot soldiers in it. Put the next one up, please. This is a different one, but this is just showing a truly complex, organised network. And so dealing with something like this becomes really difficult. We can pick the eyes out of it, but they're constantly evolving, constantly changing. We've been involved in the war on drugs since the 1960s. I was a boy in the 1960s, and we're still involved in the war on drugs. And there are other factors that then play in from this point. We've introduced a prohibition, for example, on that. The question is, how many people in the community actually support it? How large is the activity going to be? How complex are the interactions going to be between the people involved in those activities? And what degree of community sympathy is there in relation to various kinds of offence? So it's widely accepted amongst members of the community that people are out there using drugs right now, and none of us are losing any sleep over it. So we're not necessarily going to be pursuing any of these issues with the police, or police will work to a certain level in this area as a deterrent, but they're nowhere near actually being able to clean it up. And these offenders, when you get into transnational crime, have one additional advantage that every other crook in the world doesn't have, which is you're now trans-jurisdictional, and you have all the benefits now of split police authorities and rules, different rules applying to the way police operate, the way they conduct investigations, how evidence is handled, different court systems, different prison systems, the whole El Salvador debate in the media at the moment. Those things exist right across the world. You are now playing in between them, and that becomes a real challenge to work. The AFP, for example, in Australia, works as effectively as it can overseas, and it's produced some amazing interdictions in this country. But there's still more to come, and it's only a small proportion of the interdictions that actually occur. So that's why we have such a hard time in trying to resolve issues like this, because it's not the same as prohibiting homicide. We prohibit homicide. There's a small number. There's horror within the community about what it means, and there's a capability with police resources, particularly the way homicide's prioritised, to get to the bottom of it. Getting to the bottom of a charts or organisations like the one I've shown you is incredibly difficult work.
Thank you, Tony. I now have tons of questions. So,
Okay.
and we only have 15 minutes. So, please, let's skip through them. A lot of them are pertaining to aid. And obviously this is a very hot topic and sensitive topic right now. And if we have any USAID colleagues online, then we're feeling for you and send you all our support. But some of the questions are, so I'm just going to try and lump a couple. How development aid can support the rule of law and government effectiveness? How can dialogue be better improved to ensure that we're tackling corruption? And then another one on aid. A challenge on my optimism. Thank you. Rightly, Michael. Current issues are indicating a resistance to assistance through aid. So how optimistic should we be?
Look, on the aid front, I think we need to think very carefully about changing the way we go about aid. I'll talk specifically about rule of law, but it applies to government effectiveness. So any programs involving governments, particularly in nations that suffer from high levels of corruption and transnational crime. When we build those aid programs, and I've been stuck in this circle for so long, I keep trying to break it, we have a simple formula. We're going to go in and we're going to train them. They obviously can't do the job because they don't know how. And that's never true. Then we look at them and we say, they haven't got the equipment to do the job. We'll provide the equipment and we'll give them some more training. And then we do things, particularly with police. We say, oh, look at the infrastructure you've got, terrible rundown mud hut of a police station with broken windows. We'll build you a brand new concrete and glass police station. The reality is that's not what stops police from performing their jobs. Some of the best, probably the best police officer I've ever met was in Micronesia. He had no shoes. He didn't have a uniform. He had respect in the community. Common sense and trust was something he engendered, and he was good at understanding what was happening around him in that culture. When we look at the programs that we're going to try and introduce, we've got to stop thinking about just training. Training delivers skills. It doesn't work on, anthropological perspective. It doesn't work on values, beliefs, customs, culture. When you're in Afghanistan, for example, and they talk about corruption, what actually happened in Afghanistan was very similar to what I would expect anywhere in the world if you took $1 trillion and dumped in a pipe through a clan-based system. The people in that system have obligations and methods and ways of doing things that mean this will be perceived as other people's money, and it'll be pulled out and allocated in a whole lot of ways, but in a purely corrupt sense, as opposed to the sort of system working with little regard for the nation. In a sort of, I'm trying to think of the words, but in a purely corrupt sense, we also made huge numbers of millionaires. There are former police generals with houses in Dubai, in Islamabad. They're living in the capitals, the major cities of Turkey. And these guys who, when I first came across some of them, they were poor, relatively junior police officers. Within 3 or 4 years, these guys are multi-million-dollar property owners. Where did that come from? And it became so bad in places like Afghanistan that when positions like the position of, say, controller of customs or the equivalent came up, to get that position, you had to form a syndicate to bid for it. And that was just the nature of the place. If you were applying for a government job, you could actually take a loan out so that you could pay the bribes. And that was regarded as a reasonable basis for a loan with some of the banks in Afghanistan. So that's the environment. So if it's not about the process and us imposing a Western process, it's actually about us going back to look at how that society works, how it thinks, how it behaves, and then thinking about how we change behaviours if we can and or if we should. And just at the risk of labouring the point, one of the best behaviour change programs I came across was forced marriages in Nangarhar province. Before I'd arrived, a program had wound up where forced marriage was pretty common in Nangarhar province. They wanted to change the behaviours, so all sorts of other things have been tried. What they did with this process was actually go to the leading university for Islamic scholars in Cairo. They brought a small group of Islamic scholars to Nangarhar province. These are people with deep respect, deep understanding of the Islamic faith, who explained the grounds and the reasons why, using the hadiths and so forth, to explain to local mullahs and others why this wasn't acceptable. Forced marriage dropped through the floor. It was a simple matter of us, instead of trying to impose our views and our ways of dealing with these sort of situations on a population that would just look at us and wonder why the hell we'd want to do that. It was a matter of trying to work with them in terms that they understood. And so those sort of approaches where we look at behaviours and try to change them and try to shape a value or shape values become important. And some of the values that we're talking about government employees include an understanding that you now must put the state before personal interests and before your sectional interests. That's very hard to do in a clan-based structure. In fact, it's almost impossible. So that takes a lot of thinking and a lot of change, and also questions about whether or not we should be changing some of those customs and structures. So I don't know if that helps.
So a couple of the other questions, I think, reflect some of those or challenges, or want to explore some of those challenges. So one of the questions is, in a post-interventionist world, what are the relevant variables at our disposal to encourage greater government effectiveness and improved anti-corruption efforts? Noting that actually, this is a challenging environment for many nation states in the past few years. I have some other questions as well. So just quickly on that one.
So quickly, when we're talking about the sort of things that we look at, the most critical thing is whether or not the state wants to move to another level of development, another critical step in its evolution, if you like. The state may never want to evolve. Some of the Pacific Island states that I've dealt with in the AFP, they have incredibly solid cultures, and people aren't necessarily looking for material wealth. That's a common ambition, but it's not necessarily what they're looking for. So it's understanding what they're looking for, and it's also looking for an incentive to see if improved governance is what people are prepared to accept. And it also needs to be demanded by the population, and there needs to be action taken if it's not being delivered. But investing in it with a hope and a prayer, without saying those charts I've shown you, I've worked in a lot of those bottom-end countries, and we never behave as though that's where we are. It's almost as though, we have this notion that somehow this is another version of Australia, just a bit broken, and it's not. It's actually something completely different from Australia, and we're a bit broken when we try to understand it. But from an optimism point of view, I'm optimistic that we can engage in a more productive way, but it means losing that sense of superiority we often bring with us. We're here to fix your problems, sort of thing, as opposed to we're here to discuss with you what we might be able to do to assist you in some areas.
There's quite a few questions coalescing around illicit financial flows and money flows.
Yep.
So one of the questions is, with the distributed network, is there an overlay of the movement of money and financial gains? And so if we just follow the money and target that aspect of organized crime, will we get some more results? Let me just add a couple of extra on. Yeah, exactly. And then another one was, how can we better measure and track illicit financial flows to give better data insights? What are the challenges of that? So yeah, any reflections on measuring and or associating those particular flows?
Yeah, look, one of the things about dealing with illicit crime is that the whole process is as covert as it can be made, and it's dynamic. When we consider the ideas of tracking financial flows that will be largely hidden to us, from a detection point of view alone, we don't detect a lot of organised crime. It's unknown, it's unseen till we actually detect it. You can't act against something you can't see or you don't know exists. But, you know, once it's detected, the way money flows work, it disappears into places where it goes in one way and comes out another. There's no way to follow it. The financial rules without victimising Singapore in terms of privacy for bank accounts and financial investigations provide a very strong protection. A lot of the money that disappeared out of Afghanistan, we originally thought was going to Dubai, but later investigations showed that it was probably going via Dubai and other places to Singapore. Once it gets in there, it's completely legitimate looking in its orientation. The thing about that approach, though, this batting approach where we go in and try to beat the thing that's there, which has proven to be pretty hard to beat, is to change the nature of the way we approach organised crime. And that's where the resilience side of the organised crime index, I think, and we've had this discussion very much like you, is more important than the criminality side. If you can make the environments strongly resistant to organised crime, that's a big start. And that means things like transparency, accountability, all the sorts of things that are picked up in that side of the measurement. And in particular, political leadership. Political leadership's corrupt. Everything else is broken anyway because there's no heart in the machine. So that becomes a major issue for dealing with organised crime. But the other side of trying to build up a resilience to it is, this has slipped my mind, as I get older, it happens more often. The resilience thing, I think, is more critical than the batting thing. You actually do need to do that whack-a-mole thing with the crime areas you're dealing with, because some of it's exceedingly dangerous and so forth. But if you overspend resources on some of those crimes, like look at the prohibition on drugs. We spent large sums chasing down cannabis, for example. You know, half the world, not half, lots of places in the world it's now no longer prohibited. But if we spent money doing that, there's a chart that I threw up on at the very end, I think, of that area. We spend a lot of time chasing down offences that don't have a direct victim. So, for example, offences like drug offences, the consumer, the source of demand, and the supplier are both in agreement. That's one reason people don't become that offended about it. There's no real victim. The victim, by law, is effectively the state. It's that table there that you've got that precursor on. However, if we look at what's happening with cybercrime is growing out of control. And this chart shows that by 2030, we're going to be dealing with about a worldwide, that's the top line, $12 trillion. When this group started measuring cybercrime in 2020, it was $1 trillion a year. Now, watching both the international media and the Australian media, we can see victims being reported every day. This morning, a woman living with her widowed mother, $200,000 gone. This sort of stuff's happening with increasing frequency, and it's going to be $1 trillion a month by 2030, and it's already, where's 2025? It's already $10.5 trillion. This is out of control. The community looks at it and it can see actual victims. So it's not a bunch of people over in the corner using illicit drugs, not hurting us, but doing something is probably bad for them. It's a group of people here actually damaging large numbers of people in the community financially, and we can see the victims, and we all agree, unlike drugs, this is a bad thing. So there's no doubt about it. And so every time we prioritise one of these other sources of transnational crime, with this particular category growing so rapidly, we disappoint the community. And this, unless we do something about this, we're not going to be able to bring this under control. We're talking large sums. The article that these data come from shows that transnational crime is now the third largest economy in the world if it was measured in terms of GDP equivalents, behind the USA and China. So that's how big this is. And our response is flat-footed and hopelessly weak, if that helps.
We were supposed to be being optimistic. Um, uh,
Oh, we
some
know
more.
about it. That's a basis for optimism.
Um, there's loads of questions here that I haven't answered or haven't asked you, which I'm really sorry for, and we'll get you a list of them, Tony, so that
That'd
you
be
can
great.
reflect on them, and perhaps we can address them on the YouTube chat later. Just one, I have 2 minutes left, so can I ask a very quick final one, which is there's some questions here around regional comparisons and how you
Yep.
do regional comparisons, and is that possible and plausible?
Yes, it is. All you do with the sort of data I've shown you is that you code in a region. And in fact, with some of the data, it's already coded. Now, I've only shown some of the indices here that are important. There are other great sources of data out there that we don't look at when we go into countries. So the sort of fragile states index, the international terrorism index, the international peace index, the stuff that you guys are producing on OCI. So there are a lot of stuff out there. The weakness with not the ones I've mentioned, but there are other indices out there, is their coverage is still low. So it might be 100 countries or 120. If you're missing a huge chunk of the world, you're not seeing the full picture. Whereas this stuff from the World Bank, and there are all sorts of problems with it, not problems, there are limitations to the way you should use it. So the charts I've presented would normally have great big error terms all over them. But when you're looking at a pattern, the error terms don't matter so much. And you can see those groups and the sentiment, and it gives you a notion of where to look. If you're going somewhere and you're in this part of the world, you've got serious problems that you're going to be dealing with in terms of corruption, governance, rule of law. And they're incredibly difficult environments to work in. And we've wasted huge sums of money where we could have actually helped more people if we hadn't been losing it. And my experiences in Afghanistan and Somalia are just some of the stuff where Australia's done in PNG over the years. Same sort of stuff. Very, very well. The results in some of the countries have been. No, I can't say that about Afghanistan or Somalia. In PNG, yeah, okay, they're a bit livable, but not great. So they're the sort of things that we're dealing with.
Thank you. That's right on the nose. As I said, we'll get you the list of questions because there's quite a few there that I didn't get to ask. So apologies to those of you. Thank you so much, Tony. It was really fascinating. Growing to love data. I promise I am, and you're helping. So thank you so much for making it interesting. And there were loads of accolades, as I say, on the chat as well. Great presentation, great way to present the data, and great way to use the data also. Thank you so much, everybody.
And thank you for the opportunity.